Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Hey guys, we're back.
We are back, and it's August, and then it'll be September, and then we'll officially be in the months, what's it called? The Burr month, like September, October, November, December. Like we'll be into the fall month. They're coming up.
Season.
Spooky
season.
So
today's case can be hashtag triggering. I know it's going to be hashtag triggering for me. I have a lot to say about this. But before we jump in, I want to give a really special shout out to Chelsea. She is a fellow true crime podcaster. And I want you guys to go check out her podcast, Keystone Cold Cases. She was really sweet. She sent in a review that she did on our podcast and gave us lots of kudos. And so just wanted to say thank you so much, Chelsea, for that. And you guys got another good podcast that you can go listen to. Yep.
Yeah. Chelsea's are nice.
Okay. So this episode today, you guys, has to do with cults. And if y'all are new here, hi, my name's Bailey. I'm a therapist and I hate capital HATE cults. They really bother me. They annoy me. And I'm going to try to get through it without too much ad-libbing today because I have lots of opinions about it.
Yeah. Just hashtag rein it in.
She said hashtag rein it in. So the thing is, as a therapist, therapy is supposed to be a safe space to explore your thoughts, your emotions with a trained, boundaried professional, right? It should be evidence-based unless you agree to doing experiential type of therapy, but it should be backed by lots of research, and all of the research shows evidence-based. It can reduce depression, anxiety, and trauma symptoms, right? It improves your relationships, your overall well-being. But the question today is, what happens when the people you trust the most to help you heal your mind start controlling every corner of your life? When therapy becomes essentially a form of captivity. And unfortunately, that's what happened inside the Sullivanian Institute, a New York psychotherapy collective. Just those words together make me really uncomfortable. A New York psychotherapy collective that promised liberation, but delivered essentially manipulation, coercion, and abuse. Like the trifecta of awful.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand the whole picture of the Sullivanians and the Sullivanian Institute. So the hub of it was in Manhattan. And yes, it was Manhattan, but it was also during the 50s and 60s. So New York, Manhattan, New York City, all of those words, it's always been a hub of cultural and political experimentation, right? A lot of new things come out of the city. And during this time in the 50s and the 60s, the city was seeing this rise in avant-garde art. We were into another feminist movement. There was experimental theater and also communal living projects that were very, very common during this time in the 50s and 60s. But more importantly, psychoanalysis was especially influential in New York during this time period. And there were therapists and analysts that were establishing strong ties to both the intellectual and the artistic communities. At the same time, young people were questioning these long-standing institutions, things like marriage and family and traditional gender roles, right? Because it was kind of the dawn of a new era. And all of this unfolded in the aftermath of World War II. So World War II had really reshaped the American landscape, our societal fabric, if you will. Soldiers were returning to civilian life. women were having to renegotiate their roles, right? They were in the workforce during the war. Everybody came home, and now they were told to go back home. A constant sense of uncertainty. Nationally, the nuclear family was promoted as a stabilizing answer to post-war anxieties. In contrast, many New York intellectuals, radicals, and artists viewed that family model as restrictive, and some sought alternatives in outlets like therapy, politics, and even collective living.
And right smack dab in the middle of all of that, the Sullivanians were thriving right on the Upper West Side, not tucked away in some weird banjo music commune in the middle of the woods. They were in upscale apartment buildings, shoulder to shoulder with professionals, parents, and kids walking to school, turning into a cult. But a cult that was not on the margins of society, but interwoven into the very fabric of New York City life. And behind those walls, what looked like therapy sessions and urban freedom was in reality a psychological trap. Today, we are diving into the rise and fall of the Sullivanians, how a radical idea about therapy and family turned into one of the strangest and most destructive cults New York has ever seen.
So, the peculiar thing about cults is that they survive by disappearing. They retreat from view, deserts, forests, ranches, even jungles, right? So, fun fact, Jim Jones built political influence in San Francisco, but when scrutiny mounted, he fled to the remote Guyanese outpost that became Jonestown. Charles Manson didn't always just live in the weird caves. He actually toyed in the LA's music scene while his quote-unquote family hid away on the Spawn movie ranch. And even Scientology, with its grand urban headquarters, created the Sea Org. I don't know if you guys know that it's called the Sea Org. And it is an elite unit that literally lived on ships in international waters to avoid oversight. However, we always have these outliers. We have the ones that do the unexpected. And the Sullivanian Institute did that. They really did something radical. They not only stayed in plain sight right there in the middle of the city, but they thrived. And again, we have to remember, this is New York City. It's one of the largest cities in the world. So by the late 1970s, nearly 600 members lived in clusters of Upper West Side apartments. These were lawyers, doctors, actors, teachers, homemakers, and even counselors and therapists. And they went to work each day, and they would come home at night and return to a hidden world of communal sex, rigid rules, and psychological manipulation. And I'm always like, this is so cult of you, right? What a culty thing to do. They even created their own avant-garde theater company called The Fourth Wall, and they staged these experimental performances downtown. The productions weren't just art. They doubled as, Bailey, can you guess where this is going? They doubled as...
What did they double as?
It was recruitment, right? This was a way for them to get people to come into the doors. To me, it's giving almost like vampire vibes, right? Like, come in, please enter into the home, and then like, you're a vampire, right?
Yeah, and can I just ask a quick question? Because I'm sure some listeners are confused. What is avant-garde? As Bailey would say it, as I would say it, avant-garde? What is that?
Yeah, so avant-garde, it's one of those terms that kind of just gets thrown around a lot, especially in the art and the cultural, historical context. So in the most plain sense, it is just a deliberate pushing of boundaries, right? And sometimes it's shocking or confusing or uncomfortable. But any way you slice it, it's art or it's movement or it's whatever that really makes the general majority, the cultural norms, very uncomfortable. So it's almost like putting this freak show mentality, like advertising almost like this freak show mentality having like luring people in of like, ooh, I wonder what this is. It's really weird and it's really pushing boundaries. And that's how they were luring people in.
And I know we're going to get back on track really quick, but just the other day I rewatched, what is that movie with Freddie Prinze Jr. and Rachel Lee Cook?
I know what she did last summer.
No, where she is the prom bet, and he turns her into. Yeah. She's All That. Is that the
She's
one?
All That, something like that. Yeah, one of those 90s kind of rom.
So yeah, definitely a 90s movie. And she's like this weird art kid and he goes to see her at her little theater. I think that's what you're talking about, because it's like a grown man wearing whitey tighties in this like representative womb on stage, and these like little people pop out. It's just like super weird and uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's kind of like what we're talking about.
Yes. I mean, yes, exactly. Yes.
And then the guy in the scene that looks at Freddie Prinze Jr. and is like, that's the director. Isn't he brilliant? Like, he would absolutely be a Sullivanian cult follower. Being like, he's just brilliant.
It really is. It really is. And that really is what the outside world kind of viewed it as, is it was like, oh, it's just art and it's different, but it's also kind of in vogue right now. And it really just looked, again, like another bohemian project that was rooted in the Greenwich Village. And that's, a lot of people refer to it as the Village, right? And so this neighborhood, this Greenwich Village, is really famous for its jazz clubs and experimental theater and radical politics and countercultural experiments and sex and family life, right? Like, it's kind of a hub of that in itself. So it made sense, right? It was all aligning.
Everything that makes me cringe and uncomfortable.
I mean, right. But everything that's really also kind of intriguing. You can't lie and be like, oh, it does nothing for me. Like, it pulls you in a little bit. Yeah. You're always like, ooh, I wonder what's under this leaf that I'm going to turn over.
Yeah. We're normies, sure.
Right. But unlike other village collectives, its foundation wasn't spiritual, it wasn't artistic. It really was just strictly psychological. So in this sense, and here's another little fun history fact, the Sullivanians weren't entirely new, right? So they really echoed this older American experiment that was called the Oneida community. So do you know the Oneida, like the flatware, like the silverware?
Yes.
That was actually a cult back in the 19th century.
Really?
And that's how they funded their cult, was they made silverware, and it's still in existence today. The cult itself is not, but the business model is still there.
That's wild.
And what the Oneidans did is they practiced this quote unquote complex marriage and communal child rearing. And this was during the Reformation era. And again, they were trying to redesign family and sex and society and all the things. So this is not a new concept, which also makes me mad about cults. Like, they never really take it and do anything new with them. Just a
rinse and repeat.
Same old song and dance.
Yeah.
But again, what was different and what was new is that these people were literally trained in psychology. They were psychotherapists. So we had Saul Newton and Jane Pierce, and they really wielded the language of therapy as bait, right? Offering young New Yorkers an escape from convention. So to ambitious artists and professionals and activists, it really did seem like a chance to reinvent not only their art, but their relationships and their sexuality, and really even themselves, right? Through this very psychotherapeutic language.
For those of y'all who haven't listened to our interview with
Rick Ross,
he is a cult expert. And one of the things that he talks about is people find cults when they are looking for something, a solution to a problem they have, or a remedy to a problem they have. So if this cult, unbeknownst to them, is selling, spiritual connectedness or being okay with your self-esteem or whatever it is, if that is kind of the chink in your armor, you're really attracted to that. And the thing here with the Sullivanian Institute is that it was really built around one man's hunger for control, and that was Saul Newton. Now, Saul had no medical license, and no formal training as a psychotherapist. And that's always the thing that blows my mind the most is these cult leaders. They don't have the CV or the resume. They don't have the experience, yet their bravado is so, I guess, amazing that people are just attracted to it. But Saul's life, and it's important to note that his life was defined by conflict. First as a communist labor organizer, then as a soldier in Spain's Civil War, and later a soldier in World War II. And those battles, those experiences really shaped the authoritarian style he carried into a therapy practice. And while Saul preached the death of family, in his personal life, he created a chaotic string of them. He was married 6 times, fathered 10 children, often with women inside the Institute. And several of his wives, including Joan Harvey and Helen Moses, were actually elevated to these senior therapist positions, which showed how kind of hypocritical he was, how his private relationships bled into the power structure of the group, right?
Yeah, well, and the reason why we spend time kind of giving you guys some background on the cities or the culture that they are in is, again, you have to remember this is post World War II. And Bailey, correct me if I'm wrong, but the term PTSD had not even been invented yet, right?
Right. It wasn't invented until many years later, but it was shell shock at that time.
Yeah. And so all of these people, they're grappling with these, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, the symptoms of that, but they didn't know what it was. Nobody in the field really had a handle on it yet.
Yes. And Saul Newton really leaned into that. Like all cult leaders, one of the things that drew people to him was his intensity. He mixed political radicalism within the language of therapy. To someone disillusioned with tradition, it felt like both rebellion and healing, until we all know it wasn't. This group that Saul had kind of created, the psychotherapy there, promised relief from all of these issues that Chelsea talked about earlier on. But Saul twisted that promise into something really dangerous for people. Alongside his wife, Jane Pierce, who, fun fact, had studied under psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan, who was very well known, Saul carved out a new space in New York's booming psychoanalytic scene. At the Institute, therapy was the focus, and it turned out to not be just guidance like it's initially intended. It started to become more and more like control. The therapists at the Sullivanian Institute would start to dictate almost every aspect of the clients' lives: where they lived, who they had sex with, even whether or not they were allowed to have children. Members weren't treated as clients with rights or autonomy, but instead kind of like subjects in a rat maze or an elaborate social experiment, all justified as analysis, quote unquote.
By the 1960s, the Institute wasn't just a clinic anymore, it was a full-blown community. Their central doctrine was simple but devastating. The nuclear family was the root of all human dysfunction. Marriage, well, that, my friends, that's a capitalist trap. Monogamy, ooh, no. That is a form of ownership. Parents, especially mothers, that's nothing more than the architects of pathology, right? So it just, I don't know, to me, it's almost like the Beastie Boys song, right? Where it's like, you gotta fight for your right to party. I feel like you had this attitude. And he was like, oh, yeah. You don't like monogamy. You don't like marriage. You don't like listening to your parents. We agree with you. And you are absolutely welcomed here. You'll thrive here.
Yeah. And the thing, again, that I think I hate the most about the whole cult leaders is the hypocrisy.
Yeah, they never do it themselves.
No, they don't. And this dude was like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Avoid traditional families, but he kept trying to build them. He kept getting married and having children and trying to formulate these families, and that's just Anyways, please continue.
Yes. And of course, these members are told to cut ties, right? You got to cut ties with your parents, with your siblings. What did Rick Ross talk about? Isolation. All cult leaders, all cults, they want to isolate. And again, they were also encouraged to rotate their sexual partners, let children be raised collectively. Even celebrities like Judy Collins dipped in, drawn by the mix of politics, therapy, and bohemian glamour. And for a while, it works, right? It does glitter. And the group grew. Their apartments buzzed with activity, dinners, music, sex, therapy sessions that blurred into parties. I mean, it really, to listen to it, it felt intoxicating, like instant community in the heart of a massive city. I mean, what more could you want? If that's what you were seeking, you had found the pinnacle.
But what felt like utopia quickly turned into a dystopian vibe. At first, members thought they had found freedom, cheap rent, endless parties, and an instant community. I mean, what more could you want living in Manhattan? But those freedoms soon turned into leashes. At the heart of the Sullivanian system was one really devastating idea, that the nuclear family was toxic and mothers were especially dangerous. Now, I just want to kind of clarify something super quick. In the therapy world, when we talk about the nuclear family, what we are talking about is a structure where it's two parents and the children typically living in a same household. That's what we mean by a nuclear family. If this structure differs, then sometimes we call that like an extended family system or dynamic, right? But in this, the belief was the nuclear family, so a mom, a dad, or two parents and children was a toxic dynamic. The group taught that parents bred neurosis and dysfunction. So the solution was simple: strip the children away from their families and place them under collective control. So what the Sullivanians practiced wasn't therapy, but a mix of coercive control and boundary violations, all wrapped in this beautiful bubble and language of psychoanalysis. In the field, this would be condemned today, currently, as exploitive therapy or undue influence because it erased autonomy, all under the guise of treatment.
Others echo the same trauma. Survivor Shelley Feinerman remembers infants ripped from mothers' arms, breastfeeding stopped abruptly, and women threatened with expulsion if they tried to hold their children longer than allowed. Fathers were often anonymous by design. Paternity blurred so no child could claim a parent fully. This wasn't childcare. It was social engineering masquerading as liberation. And it was also disgusting. So by dismantling this parent-child bond, the Institute produced generations of children who grew up disoriented, alienated, and obviously searching for identity. Many of them, now adults, have spent decades reconstructing the family they were ordered to abandon.
Now, I am going to interrupt here for just a second and totally stay on topic because I want to really explore some of the psychological piece to this and part of why this case is really concerning and annoying to me. So the psychological cost of this type of system is apparent. Human development, it begins with what psychologists call secure attachment. And that is when a baby bonds with a consistent, loving caregiver. That bond teaches trust, safety, and identity. You strip that away and you get the opposite, disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment forms when a child's source of comfort is also a source of fear, or worse, when comfort is withheld altogether. Instead of security, the child learns mistrust. Instead of belonging, they internalize abandonment. For the Sullivanian children, every instinct for closeness was pathologized, leaving them conditioned essentially for anxiety, a fractured sense of self, and lifelong struggles with intimacy. What we now recognize as CPTSD or complex PTSD was arguably inevitable for a lot of these situations. Survivors describe chronic anxiety, emotional numbness, hypervigilance, mistrust of intimacy, and an inability to sustain stable relationships. And unlike trauma from a single event, this is trauma that is woven into the fabric of everyday life. I call it paper cut trauma. A baby reaching for its mother isn't soothed. She was punished. A child crying at night wasn't comforted. He was told his need was pathology. Love itself, again, was rebranded as something wrong. Mothers, alongside their children, were broken down. Every nurturing instinct, soothing, feeding, bonding, was reframed as a weakness or manipulation. Breastfeeding was micromanaged. Affection was monitored and shamed. Women who resisted were made to feel guilty and defective, as if loving their own children was a proof of illness. So this was a complete psychological inversion. The thing that should have been the most protected, maternal care, was redefined as the enemy. Into that void stepped Saul Newton and his therapist, claiming authority over the children's identities and their lives. The result, as Chelsea had said, was generational, fractured attachment, intergenerational trauma, and survivors that would spend their whole life piecing themselves back together.
Yeah, so you think about it this way. A lot of the members that joined were post-World War II survivors, if you will. I think it's safe to call them survivors. They enter into what seems like a very enticing group. They have freedoms and they have excitement. They have children. Then they are passing that trauma down, plus the trauma that's being compounded because of the Institute. And now, of course, what piece is left as far as control? Financial. In the 60s and 70s, the Sullivanian Institute was still looking pretty great. We're still in a golden era. Again, cheap apartments, therapy built into your weekly routines, a nonstop social scene. Like, you couldn't be lonely. You had a lot of flexibility and freedom. And for young artists, professionals, even draft age men avoiding Vietnam, right? It really felt like a golden ticket. Therapists even wrote letters to draft boards helping members dodge service. Novelist Richard Price remembered it as though, quote, the gates of heaven had opened. Instant friends, instant sex, instant community. But paradise came with a price tag, as they always do. In the 80s, money became one of the Institute's main weapons of control. Therapy wasn't just weekly, it was endless, stacked with quote-unquote assessments and fines and dues that drained members' paychecks. Careers were monitored, salaries tithed. Oh, that's my favorite word. Tithed back into the Institute, and financial dependence kept people trapped. And with financial control comes, I hope you can guess it, comes with it surveillance. Members were encouraged to spy on one another, reporting doubt or disobedience. Paranoia spread until trust was impossible. These dynamics fueled a cycle of abuse. People who were exploited rose in authority, only to inflict the same violations on newer or younger members. What began as a community promising liberation for the family hardened into something disturbingly familiar, right? A rigid hierarchy built on money, fear, and exploitation. The dream of freedom curdled into a machinery of control. So these leaders continued with fining members. They started dictating their housing and they were siphoning money left and right. Then came the custody battles. And these things were erupting. I mean, they were popping up all over the place with parents that were trying to reclaim their children. Journalists began poking holes into the glossy exterior. By the late 1980s, the Sullivanians' chic Manhattan experiment had been exposed as something, for what it was. It was a cult, and one that left a generation scarred by abuse, neglect, and the hollowing out of human connection.
One of the things that I have found myself asking until I got better educated with cults and the dynamics of it is, why didn't people start to leave, right? Why did people, even in the Sullivanian Institute, why didn't they just start leaving once the cracks started to show? Well, psychology arguably can give us some of those answers. We have to think that by that point, by the time the cracks started to show, members had invested years of their lives, their friendships, their children, even their very sense of self into this institute. To walk away meant admitting it had been a lie. And that kind of realization really can shatter somebody internally. That's what we call cognitive dissonance, when facts collide with our belief systems and the mind contorts itself to protect the belief, no matter how damaging. The second piece is, there's this thing that's called the sunk cost fallacy. And it's that feeling of, I've already given up so much already, I can't walk away now. So for Sullivanians, leaving meant facing families abandoned, careers destroyed, or children being raised in neglect. It was less painful in the moment to double down than to face the devastation of what potentially had been lost or what they would lose. And the last kind of piece layered on top of this is the trauma bonding. Saul Newton engineered a cycle of reward and punishment, praise one moment, humiliation the next. That unpredictability wires the brain to cling to the abuser because submission feels like survival. It's the same dynamic seen in domestic abuse. In fact, Rick Ross even calls cults, what does he say, Chelsea?
He calls domestically violent relationships the cult of two.
That's right. So it's very similar to domestic abuse, but this was magnified across an entire community. So when outsiders ask, why didn't they just leave? The truth is, psychologically, arguably, they couldn't. Their survival instincts had been rewritten. Leaving wasn't just about walking out the door, it meant unlearning the very strategies that had kept them alive inside.
Now, after decades of running this manipulative psychobabble community, we're now in the late 1980s, and the Sullivanian Institute is really just, it's past its prime, right? It's a shadow of itself. Its public image was unraveling, and the therapists, right, and they're the quote-unquote therapists, had lost credibility. And I do want to mention, some of them were actual, trained, legitimate therapists that had joined into this group, right? It wasn't all just poppycock. There were some classically trained people that lived within this commune, but they had started losing their credibility, and defectors were speaking out. Then, in 1991, the inevitable happened. Saul Newton died. Without its authoritarian center, the Institute collapsed, and surprisingly, it collapsed almost overnight. The irony really was impossible to miss. For decades, this group had preached the destruction of the nuclear family, but when it fell apart, what remained were fractured families trying to reconnect. Adult children raised in communal apartments began seeking out biological parents and siblings they had been denied. Survivors pieced together family trees like detectives, rediscovering bonds the Institute had spent years severing. Newton's death didn't just mark the end of a cult. It marked the unraveling of an experiment that claimed to liberate people from family, only to recreate its darkest dynamics. Newton had been the domineering father, his wives the authoritarian mothers, and the rank and file the silenced children. When the structure collapsed, survivors were left to rebuild their own identities from the wreckage.
For those who left, the collapse wasn't the end of their story. Luckily, for some, it was the beginning of recovery. Walking out of a cult does not erase the psychological damage. Survivors describe the aftermath as living with the echo of rules that no longer exist, a kind of prison where the bars are gone, but the mindset lingers. The damage runs super deep. Children raised in this institute often show what psychologists are now recognizing, again, as complex PTSD, chronic anxiety, all of the stuff that we talked about. Adults who had been parents inside the group were faced with waves of guilt, realizing the dangerous love they'd been told to suppress was in fact the very thing their child had needed the most.
And I always think that the most interesting things about human beings and the human condition is that one word, resilience. There's always a remnant that's left over that creates this sense of resilience in survivors. And these survivors would go on to build support networks. They often found each other decades later. They would share their stories and fill in those missing pieces in their lives. Some wrote memoirs, others became scholars and artists and activists, and they reclaimed their narratives instead of letting Newton define them. Even Newton's own children, like anthropologist Esther Newton and filmmaker Keith Newton, grappled publicly with their father's legacy. Recovery meant relearning the things the Institute had pathologized, that intimacy isn't toxic, that love isn't ownership, that family, chosen or biological, can be healing. Survivors had to reclaim what Newton had stolen: autonomy, connection, and trust. And in doing so, they dismantled the cult's legacy in the most powerful way possible, by rebuilding the very human bonds it tried to destroy.
Now, what the Sullivanian story tells us is, or shows us, is how psychotherapy, which is something that is meant to heal, can absolutely be weaponized when power goes unchecked. Therapy works when there are boundaries, ethics, and mutual respect. But when those boundaries collapse and a therapist positions themselves as the ultimate authority, the same tools of healing can become instruments of control. Instead of helping clients question their distortions, Saul Newton and his circle rewrote reality, saying that love was pathology, doubt became a proof of sickness, and intimacy was a threat. This is the dark side of transference, a process in therapy where patients or clients project their feelings onto a therapist. So I one time had a client who really hated my guts. From the moment he laid eyes on me, he absolutely loathed me. And come to find out, his stepmother, who came into his life when he was very young, was a redheaded woman. I have red hair, and she was horrifically abusive. And so that's what we call transference, is he was putting that stuff onto me. Even though I was not his stepmother, I was not abusive, he still kind of felt that way. Now, normally, good clinicians help people understand and work through those projections, like I tried to do with that guy. I think, unfortunately for me, I was still very, very green in the field, and I didn't know what to do with it at that point. So we ended up transitioning him to another therapist caseload, which was probably the best option for the time. But in the wrong hands, transference becomes a lever for exploitation. Patients or clients can come to believe that the therapist or the leader, or in this case, Saul, knew them better than they knew themselves, and that made them vulnerable and pliable. The Sullivanian Institute reminds us that mental health spaces can be profoundly unsafe when accountability is absent. The power dynamic between therapist and client is already unequal. Add authoritarian leadership, groupthink, and ideology hostile to family or outside ties, and you create the perfect environment for abuse. That's why modern psychology emphasizes safeguards, licensing, peer review, clear ethical codes. Because when therapy stops being about empowerment and becomes about obedience, it ceases to be therapy at all.
You know, we always want to ask, why didn't people leave? But I think sometimes we forget to ask, why did they join in the first place? These weren't naive outsiders. They weren't uneducated drifters. The Sullivanians, they attracted lawyers, doctors, artists, educators, teachers, homemakers. Like they attracted a lot of just everyday, normal, great people. And all of these people seem to, have a good head on their shoulders, if you will. So again, why, right? I mean, it's said that New York in the mid 20th century was a place of deep loneliness and rapid change. Unfortunately, we're having a mirror of that in our society right now with the advent or the introduction of more social media and people having these very surface level relationships, right? Like we're more connected than we've ever been through social media, but yet we're lonelier than we've ever been. And that's really what was happening in this big city, right? There were tons of people, but there was this rampant loneliness, or that's what researchers are telling us. And also, you take that aspect and you add that psychoanalysis was trending, right? It was a fad thing. It was a hot topic. Communes and experiments in free love were spreading. I mean, people were hungry for belonging, for new ways of living outside the constraints, again, of this nuclear family that we did see in the 1930s and the 1940s, right? In the early 1940s. They wanted to get out of the office cubicles. They wanted to get away from the suburban manuscripts that seemed to be just passed out. And the Institute offered instant community, right? I always think of, it makes me think of the beginning scene, the opening scene to Moulin Rouge, right? Where it's just like this bohemian, everything's on fire and lit up, right?
And beautiful and love and fun and daring and all the bright, shiny things.
I mean, it's kind of this carpe diem. You're just seizing the day. You're living in this moment. And sociologically, this really taps into this broader theme, right? Like human beings crave meaning and they crave connection. And especially in a time of cultural upheaval. Again, I personally think that we are seeing this right now. So, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we might be hearing of cults that pop up during this time period. I don't know, not saying they will, but again, there is a lot of mirroring there. Whether it's a commune in the woods, a self-help empire, or a wellness influencer, wink, wink, with millions of followers, the same appeal is there. We'll give you belonging, we'll give you purpose, but it's always at a price. The Sullivanian Institute is a cautionary tale not just about cults, but about the human condition. In a crowded city of millions, members still felt invisible, and the Institute offered them a way to be seen, even as it devoured their autonomy. It's a reminder that loneliness it's a reminder that loneliness and the search for meaning are powerful social forces that can lead people into the arms of groups that harm as much, way more, than they heal.
When we look at the Sullivanian Institute today, it feels both distant but eerily familiar. Modern therapy culture, wellness groups, coaching industries sometimes blur the line between guidance and control.
The language of empowerment can become a mask for manipulation.
The Sullivanians may be gone, but the warning remains. When a therapist becomes a messiah, who saves the patients? And that, our dear listeners, is the awful story of the Sullivanians and what happens when therapy becomes a cult.
Absolutely. That's a lot. Good job, Bailey. I know that you kept your comments to a minimum.
I just always think of people being like, get on with it. Get on with the story. Blah. But one thing I have to speak out on because it makes me irrationally angry, and I'm not going to name drop because that's not appropriate, but my sister-in-law has a good friend. Her best friend owns a cake company, a cake store. And she has a very active social media account, Facebook, Instagram, what have you. And one of the cakes that she recently did, it was a client order cake, and it was a picture of a MAGA hat, and it said, "Make America Great Again." And underneath that post, this woman who was another small business owner was like, "That's disgusting." That's fine. If you think that, that's fine. But this woman ended up sharing it to her work page and was like, "Don't support this disgusting human who baked this disgusting cake." And, she threw out the buzzwords like bigot and Nazi and things like that, I'm pretty sure. So all of that to say, I'm reading through these comments because I can't help myself, right? And there's a woman who pops in and is just like regurgitating this horrific stuff. And Chelsea, she was a life coach. And I feel like this is super relevant because I'm not on one side of the fence or the other. My point is, I literally asked her, I said, "What do you do when you have a client, someone who pays for your services to make their life better? What do you do when you have a client who has an issue in their life, a huge disagreement, a complete polar opposite view of something?" I said, do you help them cope? Do you help give them tools? Do you help them process through that? And it was just so disturbing to me that I have seen therapists, I have seen life coaches, I've seen all these professionals very loudly and proudly saying really awful things one way or the other. And I think it is the most disgusting thing, personally. And it just reminds me of that. It's like a cult. It's that group think. You know what I mean? And it reminds me of the Salem witch trials. It reminds me of the satanic panic in the 80s and 90s that we've covered. We've covered both of these mass hysteria. And it's just wild to me because that, like, it's the whole cult think. You know what I mean? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I hate to toot our own horns, and I don't think I'm intentionally doing this, but if you guys want to know more about this stuff, like I said, you can always go back and find our interview with Rick Ross. I would say he is a vetted individual on just cult research, cult knowledge in general, because I really think that knowledge is power, and educating yourself on, man, this group that I'm in, or this I think I'm going to leave it at group. This group that I'm in, they might have some red flags. And as Bailey is always saying, stop looking at red flags. Stop looking at red flags, saying they're pink, and then saying that my favorite color is pink.
Right.
This is why we're here. We educate, we talk about these hard topics, mainly because we want to protect you guys and give you at least some information. So yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's just its own version of a cult. They might not have a meeting place. They might not have a communal nursery. But yeah, this group thinking is really dangerous at the end of the day. So
yeah, no matter what side you're on.
So take some time to reflect. Self-reflection goes a long ways. Ask a friend, ask an outsider. Does this seem weird to you?
Yeah.
Ask it about your church. Ask it about your church. Ask it about your school. Ask it about,
your boyfriend or girlfriend.
Your boyfriend or girlfriend. Like, does this seem weird to you?
Yeah.
Ask ChatGPT. It'll tell you if it's weird.
Yeah. And as a friendly reminder, a good therapist should never give you direct advice. Okay? A good therapist should lay out observations and hold your hand while you explore that and make a decision that is best for your life. You are allowed to fire your therapist. You are allowed to say this is not a good fit. You are allowed to ask them to refer you to somebody with a different specialty or an area of expertise, right? If you were a victim of a cult, then work with a therapist who's worked with survivors from cults. It's the best option you can do. If you're a sex addict, work with somebody who works with sex addicts. If you're an alcoholic, work with a therapist that knows addiction. Like, find a therapist that respects your boundaries, respects your autonomy and your belief systems, and doesn't ever make you feel uncomfortable in, trying to express yourself. Now, Obviously, there's caveats. If you're like, I am going to kill my neighbor's dog, and they're like, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. That's not what I'm talking about. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So
Sure.
I just feel really strongly about that. If it feels off, it probably is off. And maybe you don't feel it's off, but if 3 or 4 or 5 of your close people say it's off, then it probably is. And with that, I am digressing officially. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for hanging out with us on this wild and culty crazy ride.
And as always, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.
Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast. Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on the flip side.